Good morning. I am Michael Backus. I am the Chief Product Officer of Perfect. We're a cannabis company based in California, and we design enhanced entourage blends of cannabis designed to deliver specific effects. So what I'm going to talk about today is entourages, practical entourage design. The whole concept of entourages really derives from the medicinal chemist who discovered THC, Rafi Mechoulam. And he coined it to describe the interactions between a couple of cannabinoids, THC and CBD, and how they modulated the effects of each other. Later in the 2000s, Ethan Russo, a neurologist who was working with GW Pharmaceuticals, wrote a paper called Taming THC, where he talked about how terpenoids, the essential oils in cannabis, could modify the effects of cannabinoids, specifically THC. And this was to try to explain some of the strain effects that had been noticed, where specific cultivars of cannabis exhibited different effects from one another. And this had been talked about for years, that, Thai stick had a different effect than an Afghani indica, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason for this appeared to be the difference in chemistry between these varieties of cannabis. This idea of chemotypical differences in cannabis was really a hot topic, beginning with the publication of Russo's paper. Until then, the most sophisticated differentiation amongst cannabis varieties was to throw it in the sativa or indica basket. And the problem with that is, as I've said before, describing the pharmacological effect of a cannabis cultivar by the shape of the plant itself, by its morphology, is like predicting the taste of a nut by the shape of the tree. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Another problem, though, with teasing out entourage effects, these interactions between cannabinoids and terpenes, cannabinoids and cannabinoids, terpenes and terpenes, is that there's a very, very potent placebo effect that comes along with cannabis. In fact, the body's endocannabinoid system has been shown to actually modulate the placebo effect, as has been studied in pharmacology for decades. And the other thing is that a lot of pharmacologists really have a problem with this whole idea of entourage effects, because they say that the evidence is extremely thin for entourage effects. So today we're going to kind of explore it. And I happen to disagree with those who criticize entourage effects, because I've just seen them up close and personal for too long. I've tested them with groups of patients when I worked in medical cannabis dispensaries. And I think there's really something there. And the truth is now we're starting to see some compelling evidence. There was a recent study from University of Arizona that indicated that some of these terpenoids in cannabis are behaving like cannabinoids, and that could explain some of the things we're seeing. There's an ongoing series of studies at Johns Hopkins that Ethan Russo and Ryan Vandry are currently conducting, and the preliminary results look very promising to support real entourage effects between terpenoids and cannabinoids. But there's also the myth of potency. A lot of cannabis consumers who go into dispensaries are hell-bent on selecting their products based on potency. And a lot of this is because there's really no other objective measure available to them. Very few dispensaries test their inhaled products for terpenoid content, but almost all of them test them for THC content. And so what happens is that people think they're going to get more bang for their buck if they buy the highest THC flower that's available for them if they plan to inhale or vape cannabis. In my experience, this is a complete myth. The truth is that the entourage effects caused by terpenoids actually deeply impact the perceived potency of inhaled cannabis product. And in fact, recently, we raised the potency on my company's products simply to compete with the fact that they were simply being judged by their THC content. But what's really interesting is even though I took the average THCA content from 28 to almost 40%, most people notice no difference whatsoever in the perceived potency of the product, which is really, really interesting. So what's going on with entourages? The truth is we don't completely know yet, but we're learning a lot more. And today I'll try to show you a little bit about how I approach them in the design of my products. So the elements of entourage, cannabinoids. We basically look at the effects of active THC once the THCA has been decarboxylated. We don't really look at the effects of THCA. We haven't really noticed much at the doses at which consumers are being exposed. As far as other cannabinoids like CBD definitely modulates the effects of THC. In fact, I used to have a group of friends who I'd go out with socially who were cannabis cultivators, and their favorite thing to do was to make me uncomfortably high on THC. And for years, I really kind of tried to avoid going out with them and being put in that situation. But what I learned how to do was add CBD to the mix. And what I would do is I would predose with CBD, about 60 milligrams. And then I could go out and basically be exposed to almost any level of inhaled THC and have no anxiety or any issue whatsoever. And the impact of CBD on THC is that it takes a little bit of the sharpness and focus off the euphoria and results in kind of a fuzzy high. A lot of people actually find that somewhat unpleasant. Robert Connell Clark, who wrote the noted book, Cannabis, Evolution and Ethnobotany, actually told me many times that he really wasn't a fan of CBD at all because he felt that it really diminished the quality of effect associated with THC. Other cannabinoids that come to the fore recently, such as THCV, to a lesser degree, CBDV, CBN, Delta 8, THC, CBG. And it's a little early to say specifically what kind of impact these are going to have on entourage design. However, they clearly will have an impact. But for the most part, we don't really completely understand the effects of these so-called minor cannabinoids particularly well. THC and CBD are well understood. THCA and CBDA, the acidic forms, are considerably less understood. CBG, we have a basic understanding of it, but we have almost no understanding as part of an entourage, for example, with THC or CBD. The propyl cannabinoids, such as THCV and CBDV, are really poorly understood. And there's an enormous amount of claims out there for, THCV as the Lamborghini of cannabinoids. In my experience, it's not that at all, but time will tell. I think there's an enormous amount of hype around THCV that'll shake out in the next couple of years. Terpenoids, we understand increasingly. The best understood terpenoids today are probably limonene, beta-caryophyllene, to a lesser degree, myrcene, linalool, and those are the ones I like to work with, along with terpinolene and ocimene. Terpinolene and ocimene are what I call window pane terpenoids, in that, for the most part, they are letting the effects of the principal cannabinoid through, in my case, THC. They don't modulate the effect of it that much in my practical experience. But what's happening with these compounds when they interact is they interact with receptors, both the cannabinoid receptors, but to a lesser degree, the serotonin receptors, the dopamine receptors, and others, ion channels, sodium and potassium, calcium. And then also there's the possibility of the formation of dimers when these compounds interact, where you have basically a new biochemical entity being formed between receptors called a dimer. And these are potentially really, really interesting because they may eventually, dimer effects may eventually explain some of the subtler and more complex effects that we're noting in these cannabis entourages. The biggest issue right now, though, is that there are so many potential interactions with these pharmacologically active compounds that you risk falling into a combinatorial abyss where you have so many interactions at so many different levels of subtlety that it's really, really tough to prove what precisely is going on. So in my experience, it's really, really hard to sit down and design an entourage. They're really, really tricky, and the results of experimentation can be quite surprising. When you've put an entourage together, you have to administer it and apply it. And what I work principally with is smoking and vaping. I've experimented in the past with colleagues to investigate buccal entourages, which are entourages that can be absorbed through the tissues lining the mouth. To a lesser degree with swallowed entourages, because mammals and most animals have developed systems to protect themselves from these plant chemicals crossing the blood-brain barrier. And so when you swallow a terpene entourage, for example, it's almost always destroyed in the stomach. Now, there are some ways to protect that and limit that and potentially get these compounds into the bloodstream. But there are some potential problems that come with that as well, which is if you encapsulate one of these terpene molecules so that it gets past the gastric acids and all the way into the bloodstream, then when that terpene molecule is liberated, what happens to the encapsulation compound? Where does it go? Where does it get stored? Is it potentially problematic? We don't know yet. So for now, I kind of had a tendency to ignore trying to get entourages into people through edibles. And then there are other ways to potentially see entourage effects, topically, rectally. Yeah, we'll see, who knows, maybe eventually by transdermal patches or something even more exotic. So how do you compose an entourage? The first thing you do is you keep it simple. When people first, and still to some degree in vape pens today, when people try to copy entourages, what they fall into is the trap of taking cannabis variety to a lab, testing it, and then just trying to mimic that terpene and cannabinoid test result in their formulation. And it's kind of ridiculous, actually, because a lot of the trace terpenoids and things aren't particularly potent, and they are certainly not very potent at the titers they're being found in these flowers. So I have a tendency to kind of keep it kind of top level. I want the predominant terpenoids and the predominant cannabinoids, unless I'm pretty certain that there is an effect being generated with very, very small amounts. I also like to ignore nature in the sense that I used to be involved in a large cannabis breeding program, and we would breed to get certain cannabinoids and certain terpenes together in unusual combinations. But the genes that control the synthases that make that possible within the plant, it's hard to get some of them to play well together. So you very rarely see a limonene and a terpinolene predominant plant. You'll see a terpinolene dominant plant, or you'll see a limonene dominant plant, but you won't see the two of them play nice together. And that seems to be hindered by some genetic limitations that can probably be overcome. But the thing is that by ignoring nature and by blending varieties together, or blending extracts together, or blending extracts and terpenes and flower together, you can do a lot of things very quickly that you can't do if you are doing conventional plant breeding. So that's what I've been doing. What we do at Perfect is we do an extraction of fresh frozen flower, and then we blend dried flower material and the resulting high terpene extracts together and make our products. And this has been terrific for us because we can get consistency every single time. In a lot of natural products, variation is a bane. A lot of cannabis flower varieties that are sold in dispensaries, they vary widely crop to crop. But by formulating these entourages, I can deliver a consistent product every time. And that's really what I'm interested in. So you can ignore nature and you can combine these things together to produce entourages that nature hasn't quite achieved yet. So let me give you an example of an entourage. Let's call it persecution, okay? I want to design an entourage to make somebody feel intensely self-conscious and mildly paranoid. How do I do that? I'm not going to do this obviously as a commercial project, but I'll just tell you how it would be done. The easiest way to do it is to take a THC, beta-caryophyllene, a little myrcene for impact, beta-caryophyllene for the kind of speedy effect that you're also going to get from the THC, and just take those three elements and put them together and make sure there's nothing else around to potentially buffer those effects. So virtually zero CBD, no linalool, no limonene, none of that stuff. Let's just stick with beta-caryophyllene, THC, and a little myrcene. That will give most people a dysphoric effect. That's a malicious entourage. Now, I don't make those for a living, but this is an example of why some people have dysphoric effects on high THC cannabis, because they'll run into a high caryophyllene strain. And what's interesting about that is caryophyllene is kind of the cockroach of terpenes. It's almost impossible to kill, so it hangs around forever. And when you smuggle cannabis, like they used to, the only real terpenoid that would survive the transit was beta-caryophyllene. So when most people got the cannabis after it came here from Colombia or wherever, it was basically super high in caryophyllene and moderately high in THC. And it caused dysphoric effects in a lot of people. And that's why they stopped using cannabis. Let me talk about a real entourage that I designed. So these are the things I'm trying to do with an entourage. I'm trying to modulate the effects of THC typically, or amplify the effects of THC, as the case may be, reduce some of the dysphoric effects. So, for example, potentially control the amount of caryophyllene I have, or figure out a way to modulate the effects of caryophyllene. Sharpen the effect to potentially increase focus associated with THC alone, or soften the effect to provide more of a comfort. So I did that with a product called Pick Me Up, which is designed to be a daytime product. It has a lot. It produces a lot of energy. This is this chart you're seeing here. This photograph is from NAPRO Research, and SC Labs in California has licensed it, and all of the compliance results that test for terpenes in California inhaled products now, they come with a phytofact. So you can download this and you get this little graph here, and you can see what the likely effects will be for the consumers who inhale it. So Pick Me Up, daytime strain, energy, a little bit of focus, a little bit of inspiration, but enough comfort to balance out the speedy side of the energy caused by the caryophyllene and the THC together. And inspiration, that comes from the citrus type terpenes that have a tendency to provide some mood elevation. So if I was redoing this graph today, I wouldn't call it inspiration as much as I call it mood elevation. It lifts your spirits and gives you energy. And so it has a tendency to be relatively inspiring. How do you protect an entourage? Well, you protect an entourage primarily through temperature. Monoterpenoids are super, super sensitive to temperature and oxygen. And what happens is that at room temperature, intact dried cannabis flower is going to lose like 50% or more of its monoterpenes within 60 days. The terpenoid alcohols are a little sturdier, like linalool, but things like beta-caryophyllene and the other sesquiterpenes, they're pretty sturdy. And for the most part, they'll survive a while at room temperature. But if you really want to preserve monoterpene entourage, where a lot of the interesting effects happen, you really want to control the temperature. That temperature control starts at about 48 degrees and below. Now, there's a recent study that showed that, from Israel, that showed that extremely cold temperatures appear to sublimate some of these lighter, more volatile molecules off. So we're going to have to study it a little bit more, because it may be that you want it cold, but you don't want it too cold. So that's something to think about. The other thing is oxygen control. That's a little story. A company I was working with had gotten a license to open a dispensary in Washington, D.C., but the city government hadn't gotten all the regulations in place. So they licensed this facility, gave them the go-ahead to start cultivating. And then what happened is that they finished a crop, harvested it, dried it, and they didn't have any place to sell it because the city hadn't flipped the switch on the dispensary licenses yet. The dispensaries were there waiting for the product, but they didn't have the ability to get them because the regulatory apparatus wasn't up and running. So the people had to take their crop and figure out a way to preserve it. And the way they did it, and actually quite effectively, was through using oxygen absorbing packs. They probably could have also used an inert gas like nitrogen, and packed it so that there was not much oxygen, and they put it in a cool room, about 46 degrees. And they actually managed to keep the crop, which was primarily OG Kush and notoriously sensitive to temperature-based degradation, in really good shape for about 3 months. So that when it was finally got to the shops, it was really working well and smelling well and everything you want with OG Kush. And then the third thing is just abject trickery. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that trickery, but there's a lot to be learned about how to preserve these entourages. And yeah, I encourage you to do it. It's a really, really fascinating field, and I absolutely love it. It's my favorite job I've ever had, and I've had some good jobs. So I hope you enjoyed this little walk through entourage design, and I hope it inspires your own. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to getting your questions.